Good morning and welcome to yet another Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School program. We are joined together this morning to consider some interesting ideas about what connects body and soul, or whether these two are somehow separate. And in order to do this, we will be watching a short video, or not so short, by Richard Swinburne, who is from Oxford University. As an introduction to today's contemplation, I'm going to read some texts from the Ecclesiastics. Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, wickedness was there, and in the place of righteousness, wickedness was there as well. I said to myself, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for he has appointed a time for every matter and for every work. I said to myself with regard to humans that God is testing them to show that they are but animals. For the fate of humans and the fate of animals is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and humans have no advantage over the animals, for all is vanity. All go to one place, all are from the dust, and all turn to dust again. Who knows whether the human spirit goes upward and the spirit of animals goes downward to the earth? So I saw that there is nothing better than that all should enjoy their work, for that is their lot. Who can bring them to see what will be after them? All this I laid to heart, examining it all, how the righteous and the wise and their deeds are in the hands of God. Whether it is love or hate, one does not know. Everything that confronts them is vanity. Since the same fate comes to all, to the righteous and the wicked, to the good and the evil, to the clean and the unclean, to those who sacrifice and those who do not sacrifice. As are the good, so are the sinners. Those who swear are like those who shun an oath. This is an evil in all that happens under the sun, that the same fate comes to everyone. Moreover, the hearts of humans are full of evil. Madness is in their hearts while they live, and after that they go to the dead. But whoever is joined with all the living has hope, for a living dog is better than a dead lion. The living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. They have no more reward, and even the memory of them is lost. Their love and their hate and their envy have already perished. Never again will they have any share in all that happens under the sun. Go, eat your bread with enjoyment, and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has long ago approved what you do. Let your garments always be white. Do not let oil be lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life that are given you under the sun, because that is your portion in life, and in your toil at which you toil under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do with your might, for there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol, to which you are going. Let's pray. Our Father, thank you for today's day and for the opportunity to be with each other and to think about you and to praise you. Be with us. Give us wisdom, give us time, give us patience, and give us insight. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Monty, could you please start the video? Remember to start the audio as well.
In theology here at Biola, and I have with me today two esteemed Christian philosophers. On my right is Professor Richard Swinburne, Emeritus Noloff Professor of the Christian Religion at the University of Oxford, and to his right is Dr. Tim O'Connor, Professor of Philosophy at Indiana University. Our theme at the Center for Christian Thought this year is Neuroscience and the Soul, and so we will largely be staying in that realm of discussion, but who knows, we might stray elsewhere. I thought I'd start out by asking you, Richard, your view, which you call, as many others have, substance dualism. Could you offer just a brief description of what substance dualism is? And then also, why should an average Christian layperson be concerned with whether or not substance dualism is the correct account of human nature?
I think that all humans on earth consist of two parts, a body and a soul. And the soul is the part that thinks and feels and decides, and the body is the part that is in causal interaction with it and causes some of our feelings, and we learn about the world through our eyes and ears, and we act on the world with our arms and legs. So the body is the vehicle through which we learn about the world and through which we act upon the world. But the real essential me is the soul. At death, these two come apart. The body decays eventually, but the soul is still there. And it's there, in my view, ready to be joined to a new body in the general resurrection, which God will bring us all to life. In the meantime, the normal Christian view has been that the soul continues and humans continue to exist, but only with souls. The souls will be reunited to possibly the remains of the old body, but at any rate many other new parts, so that it forms a new body in the general resurrection. That's almost always been the normal Christian view of the matter. Why does it matter? Well, it matters firstly because of the normal Christian view that we continue to exist after death before any general resurrection, and since our bodies are decayed and in the ground, it must be the soul which, if we don't have a soul, we don't continue to exist. But more importantly, the soul is the vehicle of our identity. That is to say, let's ask, what is it that makes a future person at the general resurrection me? Well, that person can't have all my body. Many bits have decayed. At any rate, even in life, I have different bits all the time. New cells replace old cells. So what would make a future person me? And if you say, well, it would be that the person with the future body has certain memories and certain character, well, there could be innumerable people with rather similar memories and rather similar character, but that wouldn't make them me. At any rate, who knows how much of our memories of our past life we might have at the general resurrection. There's got to be something that makes a future person me, and if the soul is the essential part and continues to exist, then the future person is me if it has my soul, otherwise it isn't me. So the soul is the guarantee of a unique person after the resurrection being me. And since life after death is important, the soul is the guarantee of that life after death. So for these reasons, it is very important that we hold this view.
Tim, could you offer a brief description of your view, emergent individualism, and as well, why should the average Christian be concerned that your view is the correct view of the matter?
Right. Well, let me start by saying that I hold my views on this, as well as many other philosophical matters, rather tentatively. It could well be true that mind-body dualism is correct, that the soul is, the biblical language of the soul is properly understood to refer to an immaterial part of me that's separable in principle from my body. Still, I tentatively incline towards a different view, on which I am, all of my parts are physical parts. I'm a biological organism, but that many of the capacities that we most associate with ourselves as persons, our capacities of thought, action, desire, intention, and so forth, these capacities emerge from the body. They're not reducible to bodily processes, but they are caused and sustained, partially caused and sustained by the proper functioning of our brains and nervous systems are required for these capacities to persist and to function properly. And so I call this the emergent individual's view. Why is it important to hold this view? I think there's more than one view that a Christian layperson could be drawn to that would be adequate both for theological purposes and for purposes of integration with other things we know. But I prefer this view because I'm much drawn to Francis Bacon, the famous thinker of the early modern era, who spoke of God's two books, the book of his works, of creation or of nature, and the book of his word. And both books, through both books, we learn about ourselves and important complementary truths. And it seems to me that in recent years, especially since about the mid-20th century, we've come to learn increasingly a lot about one aspect of the book of God's works, namely how our bodies function, and specifically our brains and how they develop. And it seems to me that a view on which human persons are fully embedded in the natural world it's going to be important to maintain, both when we look at the biological history of the slow emergence and development of increasingly sophisticated kinds of living things, including ourselves, much later in the game, and then also what we know about organismic individual development from embryonic state all the way to a fully matured human being. There's a gradual development and an increasing sophistication of mental function that correlates very closely with the development and the development of our brain and nervous system. And so a view on which new capacities are emerging as brain structure is developing in maturity seems to me to fit well with the information that we have. And so I think it's important as a Christian, and I'm sure Richard agrees, that we integrate what we think about human persons based on revealed truths with what we come to learn to varying degrees of confidence from the study of the natural world, because certainly we do get information about persons and our natures from scientific study of human beings.
I have no quarrel with the idea that soul and body are closely connected. Indeed, I emphasize that our mental powers are sustained by our bodies and that we act through them. But my views on the soul are not derived from, although they are of course compatible with, they are not derived from Christian doctrine, but there seem to me compelling arguments from purely secular knowledge in favor of this view. If you were to try and tell the whole history of the world, you would have to tell what happened to physical things, that is to say, tables and chairs and planets, which are physical in the sense that everybody has equal access to them. We can each see as well as anybody else that there's a table there, that there's a planet out there in the sky, and we can each see as well as anybody else what is going on in my brain, at least if we take trouble to learn a little neuroscience. It's a public piece of knowledge. If you can find out what's going on in my brain, I can find out what's going on in my brain, and conversely. But when we come to thoughts and feelings and beliefs and desires and intentions, the subject, the person who has them, has privileged access to them. He or she knows better what they're thinking about, what they're intending. You can, of course, make an inference from my behavior about what I'm trying to do. And maybe if you look at my brain, that'll tell you a bit more. But then I could make that inference from my behavior and look at my brain. But I have a greater access to it because I'm actually doing the trying, and I know that. And therefore, there are truths about the mental life which simply are not truths about, even though they may be caused by goings-on in the brain. And given that, all the same, even if you knew, even if by some mechanism or other, you knew everything not merely that was happening to my body and brain, but what thoughts were connected with that, there would be still an all-important truth that you wouldn't know. That is to say, who was having these thoughts? Because after all, the world could in all public respects be the same, only if I had your body and you had mine. And if I was having your thoughts connected with your body and you were having my thoughts connected with my body. So a full account of the world will not merely have to describe bodies, physical things, and what physical properties they have, mass, size, shape, and so on. Also, it must describe the mental goings-on, the thoughts and feelings, but it would also need to add who was having these thoughts and feelings. The world could be different, as I say, in the respect that you could have my body and I could have yours, but it could also be different in the respect that a quite different person could own this body and I could never have existed, and yet not merely would all the public phenomena be the same, but the same thoughts and feelings would be going on. So a full story of the world has got to tell the history of persons, and merely supposing that's the history of bodies would have left something out. It would have left out who was having the body, who were having the thoughts and the feelings. And so there must be something extra and beyond, and that something is not merely the existence of a mental life, but the existence of someone who has a mental life. We can give it a name for the extra bit that's essential, call it a soul. But if you say there is no bits to me apart from my body, then it would follow that we would know all about the history of the world if we simply knew about the history of bodies and the feelings that were associated with them. But clearly we wouldn't, because you wouldn't know who was in control of the body. So inevitably, the very fact of human consciousness forces us to say we can only make sense of this in terms of a soul. And given that there's a soul, then it's a part of me, and it could continue to exist after death. Of course, I don't think you can give an argument of a philosophical kind to show that it does continue to exist after death, but I can give argument of a philosophical kind to show that it could, and revelation can make it clear to us that it does. But if the alternative doctrine were true, if the only things were physical things, then our bodies could be reduced not merely to bones in the grave, but could be turned into energy, so there would be nothing left to constitute us. And that seems to me would rule out life after death.
I'll just briefly respond. The difference between the view that I'm proposing and the more traditional view that Richard very capably defends is in some respects a rather subtle one, and that's borne out by the fact that much of what he said, especially the opening part of his remarks, I fully agree with. That is, I think our mental lives cannot be captured in purely physical terms. My conscious thoughts and feelings, intentions, goals, and so on are aspects of me, properties I manifest, capacities that I have, that are not the simple resultant of even complex neurophysiological processes. They are causally sustained by those processes, but they're distinct from those processes. So we agree on that. And then the difference between our views is just where do those capacities reside? And I say they reside within the living organism. They are associated with the living organism. And so then that would, Richard says there's a further fact about who owns the thoughts. That is, he suggests that it's possible that things might have been so constructed that I might have controlled his body and he might have controlled mine. But a supposition that that's so much as possible, I think, depends on presupposing the mind-body dualism that this alternative rejects. So if in fact these capacities are capacities of this organism, and his psychological capacities are capacities of that organism, then that would not be a possibility. That there is not that further fact to be accounted for.
So Richard, Tim has suggested that his view, this emergent view, comports with the contemporary neuroscience, and some might think that substance dualism is in trouble when it comes to contemporary neuroscience, because these things that we used to think that the soul was responsible for, we're finding out that the brain is responsible for. So how do you respond to this idea that the soul is, we have kind of a soul of the gaps response, that we don't need the soul anymore, given what we understand about the brain?
Well, I've given a straight philosophical argument for the existence of the soul. Your point is that it doesn't fit with contemporary neuroscience. Well, I don't see that at all. I've no objection to any particular detailed result that contemporary neuroscience has made. Quite clearly, we are influenced, our choices are influenced by goings-on in the brain, but this isn't news. We've always known that humans are influenced in their choices by physical goings-on. It's well known that if people haven't eaten for 24 hours, they feel hungry and they are inclined to eat. This has been known for millennia. All that neuroscience has done has been to add a lot of further bits of information of that sort. Neuroscience has told us the mechanism by which lack of food causes the desire to eat. And neuroscience has pointed out other mechanisms that are at work causing desires. But neuroscience has never shown which persons will inevitably act on the desires to which they are subject. We have a choice of whether to act on one desire or another, whether to do what we believe good or to yield to a temptation to do what is evil. And no result of neuroscience has shown that we can't do that. Some results of or rather some statements of neuroscientists about what they have achieved seems to be a manifestly false account of what in fact they have achieved.
Tim, Richard made the claim that, if I'm getting it right, no amount of contemporary neuroscientific evidence is going to show that there isn't any such thing as the soul, understood in a dualist sense. Do you agree with that? And then if so, how is it then that you made the claim earlier that you think this emergentist view comports better with biological evidence, including neuroscientific evidence?
Good. I think I probably agree with Richard that neuroscience is, at any rate, unlikely to demonstrate the non-existence of the soul understood as a purely mental substance. Scientific theorizing is always a matter of putting an interpretation, trying to put the best interpretation on observable facts. It doesn't usually proceed by way of outright demonstration of truths. It's just certain theories seem to prove more fruitful and more predictively powerful than other theories, and are therefore we run with them until better theories come along and new data that need to be accommodated. So, in a nutshell, if you've been comparing our views, there's a strong agreement on that our mental lives do not reduce to our physical lives. So what difference does it make? Well, for my view, new capacities emerge. Think about the development of a living organism, our bodies. We have a lot of, if we're fully intact, functioning adult human beings, we have a lot of sophisticated cognitive capacities and affective capacities of emotion and desire and so forth. As I understand the dualist view, one would have to suppose if the soul emerges or appears in the very early stages of embryonic development, since the soul has no parts, it's not a composed object, all of its basic capacities are sort of there from the get-go. And then as the brain matures, some of those, many of those capacities are completely latent. Young infants can't do calculus, right? But as the brain matures, then what the soul is capable of doing and engaging in thought now becomes activated. It has the necessary physical causal conditions on it. That's a possible view, but it suggests a kind of an abrupt break. So you have a very immature organism that is associated with something that has these potentially quite complicated functions already fully intact, rather than, on my view, the mental capacities, since they are capacities of the organism, develop in tandem with the development of the organism. And that just seems to me a more natural interpretation of what we know about organismic development. So.
One point one stage in your argument seemed to me mistaken. You were arguing from the fact that the soul has no parts to the fact that it can't grow in its capacities. But I don't see that follows at all. Capacities are properties of a thing, and a thing can acquire many extra capacities even if these all belong to one part. So I don't follow that stage of the argument. But more substantially, it seems to me that any theory which says there is a sharp break has a lot more to be said for it than any theory that says there is a gradual evolution. Because you took the fetus developing into the child, but if we take, for example, the gradual development of the human race from inanimate matter over time, 4 billion years ago, nothing had any feelings or thoughts. Now we have lots of feelings and thoughts. So sometime or other there must have been a first feeling or thought, some mental event that the subject was aware of and to which he had privileged access, to which of a kind that had never happened before. That seems to me inevitable. If there was once upon a time there weren't any such things, and now there are such things, there must be a first time at which such things appear. Now, of course, we don't know what that time is. My argument is compatible with the higher animals having thoughts and feelings, and therefore, by my argument, having souls. But who knows? Nobody knows whether ants have feelings or whether fish have feelings. I'm inclined to think that only mammals have feelings, but there comes a time, a sharp time, and if a theory says there isn't a sharp time, it seems to me it hasn't grasped the very nature of the mental, which is so different from the physical. It's something to which the subject has privileged access. And the moment there is a being who has mental events, has thoughts and feelings to which he has privileged access, there is someone who has these thoughts and feelings. And it's a fact about the world that that individual had them rather than any other individual. And that, given that, and given that the body doesn't carry the identity because I could have a different body, it must be another part of me that has that identity. So the very emergence of consciousness must bring with it a soul. And that's how it is. There is this sharp break in evolution because something has appeared that simply wasn't there before. And if some evolutionary theory tries to show there isn't a break, then it must be mistaken for this reason. The facts are just stare one in the face on this matter. The French neuroscientist Benjamin Libet did certain experiments in the 1980s, which other neuroscientists generalized to show, which they suggested showed that never do our intentions, our purposes, make any difference to what we do. What we do is controlled just by brain goings on, and we think we have formed an intention, and that's why we do something, but really it's just brain goings on that make this difference. And the evidence which was brought forth for that by, at any rate, the followers of Libet, was that they found that whenever somebody does an intentional action, decides to move their hand or decides to go for lunch or something, there is always some build-up of electrical potential on their skull which indicates some brain going on. And many neuroscientists, and that happens before the subject forms any intention to go to lunch or any intention to wave their hand. And so many neuroscientists said, oh, well, what that shows is that the brain event causes the motion of the hand and the intention has nothing to do with it. But of course, all that the experiments showed is that equally compatible with the experimental results would have been that the original brain event causes the intention and the intention itself causes the motion of the hand. Neuroscientists could try and do some more complicated experiment which might show that the motion of our hands was simply caused by bodily goings-on. But I don't think they could ever show that our intentions don't cause that, though in some few cases they might show that we are compelled by bodily brain goings-on to form an intention. But I see no reason to suppose that to be generally the case, because all that neuroscience throws up is information about the inclinations, the desires to which we are subject. And we all know that when faced with a choice with acting on some desire or yielding to temptation, it's up to us what we do. And nothing that neuroscience has shown has any inclination to show that it isn't in those cases.
So on this view, dualism actually helps preserve free will in a way that otherwise free will might be brought into question.
Yes, I don't think dualism is necessary for holding a doctrine of free will, but it certainly helps to bring out what is involved in it. That is to say, that what determines our actions is what we determine our action, and we determine our action in the light of reasons and desires to which we are subject, and intuitively we know, or think we know, that's how things happen, and nothing that any neuroscientist has produced shows that it isn't.
And Tim, I know you've been concerned to defend a version of free will as well. Do you think that your emergent view helps with the free will question vis-a-vis substance dualism?
I believe it's as compatible as substance dualism is with the view that we exercise a limited measure of autonomy. We are not perfectly free beings. We're constrained. As science shows, not just neuroscience, but shows for psychology, we're often subject to unconscious influences. So it's a constrained freedom of will, but I think we do have sufficient freedom that we can be held morally accountable for our choices. It's a commonplace that the popular press often does a very poor job of reporting scientific findings, and I agree with Richard that in some cases the scientists themselves are a source of the problem insofar as they put philosophical glosses on their findings that go well beyond their findings. They're putting an interpretation on their findings that the results themselves hardly imply. Although they might be compatible with the findings. And so I agree with Richard that it's often overblown some of the interesting things that are being learned about how the brain functions. But we should recognize that the science of the brain is still in relative infancy, or maybe in its adolescence, you might say at this point. Before the 1950s, very little was known about the details of brain function. And now scientists seem to have a very good handle on how individual cells of the brain, neurons interact, transmitting chemicals across synapses and that sort of thing. But how large-scale assemblies of neurons produce or are involved in the production of complicated bodily behavior, and let alone conscious choices, is still not well understood at all. There is a differentiation of function. Scientists have been able to identify different regions of the brain being associated with different functions, like the visual cortex and the auditory cortex and so forth. But most of the really crucial details about how complex behavior is produced are still wide open. And I agree that the Libet findings just show that there's activity, a kind of preparatory activity perhaps, where we know we're about to, you have to think about the Libet sort of scenario where you're being invited to engage in a specific behavior, such as wiggling your finger, within a short interval of time, and then you're just asked to spontaneously decide when you will engage in that behavior, and that there should be some sort of anticipatory brain activity to enable a smooth carrying out of that behavior when a choice is made is not terribly surprising, right? We don't, on no sensible view, whether a substance dualist view or my sort of view, or even on a materialist view, on no view do choices just come out of the blue, quite apart from any antecedent influences. I think I do want to have a view on which we have capacities to make choices that don't reduce to physical capacities, and that we consciously control that capacity, at least in many circumstances, when we're fully in control of our faculties and we're aware of real options available to us. And I think that's wholly consistent with the findings of neuroscience.
Yes, all that the neuroscientists have discovered in more detail about the goings-on in the brain before we make decisions only allow they may have established a correlation between certain goings-on and, say, the subject moving their hand, but the correlation is not 100%, it's 80% or 75%, that is to say, and that indicates that what they've discovered is an inclination to do it, to which eventually the subject may or may not decide to follow. But one point about neuroscience I wouldn't altogether agree with you about individual neurons. Sure, what is known is that the brain is a large collection of neurons, and each neuron transmits an electrochemical influence to the next neuron. But how it does this by releasing a small amount of transmitter substance which clings to the next neuron and starts an electrical pulse passing through that. But whether it does this or not just depends on just how much transmitter substance is released and just how wide the gap between the two neurons, the synaptic cleft, is, and just what happens to each bit of transmitter substance that's released. And these are goings-on a very, very small scale. And such literature as I have read is certainly favorable to the view that these goings-on, whether enough transmitter substance is released at the cleft in order to start an impulse passing through the next neuron, depends on such small differences that these differences lie within the quantum limit. That is to say, the great physical theory of the 20th century, quantum theory, is an indeterministic theory. It says that on the smallest of small scales, you can only talk about probabilities of things happening, not about inevitabilities of things happening. And the scales involved in the transmission of electric charge from one neuron to another are on that very small scale, so that whether the potential is transmitted does depend on something within the quantum limit and is therefore not predetermined. Of course, it is logically possible that these these very small differences in one neuron isn't going to make a very great difference to our large-scale behavior. On the other hand, it may make a very large-scale difference to our behavior. That isn't known, but there is undoubtedly a certain amount of indeterminism in the brain, so it would be perfectly compatible with all we know about the operation of the brain to suppose that some of its operation is not determined by physical laws.
And Richard, just since we're on this kind of issue of origins, on your view, and perhaps if you could think of it too, not just in a theistic evolutionary picture, but those Christians that hold to some sort of direct creation of the first human persons. On your view, how does the soul come into existence? You have this sharp break. What the sharp break is the emergence of the soul. How does the soul come into existence on this?
Well, there's two possible theories. Either that, as it were, it's a basic law of nature. The brain, when it reaches a certain form, a certain amount of certain kind of complexity, throws up a soul, or alternatively that God gives to individuals who have a brain of that complexity, when it reaches that stage, a soul. I don't have a very strong view which of these is correct, because I mean, God may operate through producing laws of nature which are such that when the brain acquires a certain complexity, then it throws up a soul, or conversely, he may act directly. And as regards anything I've been saying today, it's perfectly compatible with creationism. As far as anything, even if humans are not produced, don't have an animal ancestry, still there must have been a first human, and therefore again a break in the evolutionary process. So it doesn't matter, for the sake of my argument, whether the process of evolution of bodies was gradual or suddenly human bodies arrived. The production of the soul must have happened at a particular time when a particular degree of complexity was there, and that is the all-important difference, not the animal ancestry of bodies.
Tim, how would you respond to that? And particularly, again, thinking of, you might think that this emergent individual's view fits better with a theistic evolutionary picture of gradual development. But if you were addressing Christians who believe in, for various biblical, theological, philosophical reasons, perhaps even, in the direct creation of human persons, that would seem to be a view that would not fit as well with the emergent individual's view. Or do you have thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I think you've answered your own question. I do think, while the view that I'm suggesting is consistent with some sort of notion of special divine intervention in the creation of human persons, it really is tailor-made for trying to integrate with the idea that human beings are embedded in these larger set of natural biological processes, have appeared over as more complex forms of organisms have appeared via purely natural processes, human beings coming at the tail end of that, and that the idea is that even as I develop organismically, I'm acquiring new fundamental capacities as the organism matures. Whereas, and so it's an attempt to be sensitive to the idea of gradual development. I agree with a remark Richard made earlier that on any view on which the mentality does not reduce to the physical, there is some discontinuity. But there's discontinuity and there's discontinuity, and just how sharp it's an attempt to kind of minimize the discontinuity, the degree of discontinuity. But if you have a picture on which God creates human individuals at a moment in time directly, as it were, then why not go with the soul view? It has an easier time dealing with issues of survival of death in the afterlife.
On your view, what comes at the moment of death? How would you explain the traditional belief in continued existence?
Well, I should say, first of all, I have no idea how it is that God preserves us. And so, but I think it's incumbent upon a thinker that wants to have a reasonable, coherent view that it at least be possible that we survive death. So it's important as a philosopher, if you think we are, as I do, tentatively, that we are essentially embodied beings. Survival of death does seem hard to understand. It can even look impossible on reflection. And so it's important that we be able to at least imagine some kind of scenario on which it could happen, consistent with the facts of death as we know them. So here's one way it might go. It's a very speculative, science fiction-y sounding suggestion, but it's just intended to be a possibility proof, right? An indication of one way it could go. Presumably, God is more imaginative than I am, and maybe there are other ways that are better ways that it actually goes. But so here goes. Suppose that right at the moment of your death, as you're about to die, let's say you've unfortunately situated yourself vis-a-vis a fast-moving bus, and you are right in front of it, and you are a fraction of a second from being hit by that massive fast-moving bus, and so are about to die very quickly. Suppose that the matter that composes you right at that moment, each of the fundamental particles fission, split in two, as amoebas fission, right? Suppose that God has endowed the fundamental stuff that constitutes you with the capacity to fission. Maybe God miraculously brings to bear something that is a necessary condition. God triggers some kind of latent disposition, right? And so then what happens is there are now two body products of this fissioning. One right where you were at the beginning of the process, which dies instantly, right? And another, we might suppose, and here's where it sounds very science fiction-y, it in a discontinuous manner, it shows up in another location, safely out of harm's way. Or if you're the manner in which you're dying is of the decay of a disease, right? God prevents that death from occurring and brings about restoration of health. Okay, and I say that would be you, and what remains on the ground in lifeless form is a mere offshoot of you. And the reason I say that's not you is because there's no longer a continuity of the mental function that is constitutive of you as a living person. These mental functions that give you an identity as a composite whole, that make you a particular being, that's preserved in this other body. So I think it's possible. So I think this very sketchy, bizarre sort of picture perhaps shows that we could survive death, but it's an embodied survival of death. And this is contrary to the way Christians have traditionally thought about the immediate survival of death. They've thought that we've survived in a disembodied state until the time of the general resurrection. Whereas on my view, if I'm essentially an embodied thing, that would be impossible. I have to be embodied in some form or other. And then you might think that makes the resurrection a rather anticlimactic affair rather than the object of Christian hope as it has been represented in the Christian tradition. But the reason the general resurrection is held out to us as something to long for and to hope for is that it's not just a time where we are restored to a bodily state, but we are clothed with immortality, as the Apostle Paul says, that we now, our bodies sown into the ground, perishable bodies are raised imperishable. And so there's some kind of dramatic transformation that takes place. And I think that's consistent with my view, that God could dramatically, right, we are changing things even on Earth as biological organisms, and who knows what the possibilities are for God to bring about still far more dramatic changes in the constitution of our nature, consistent with our continuing honest, conscious thinking things, such that as at the end result of perhaps a very rapid process that subjectively feels like it's instantaneous, but it's actually a highly compressed, rapid, dramatic transformation, we now have bodies that are not subject to decay and so forth. And it may also be a function of a very different sort of environment that we inhabit too, that accounts for some of the difference.
May I make a comment on that? That seems to me a wildly speculative ad hoc hypothesis. The suggestion that at death we split into two and a total duplicate of our bodies is produced, but we don't see it because it's taken away into a fifth dimension or something like that. There's not the slightest evidence this is true. This is only being brought in order to make sense of how it could be that we survive death, whereas the more traditional account which I have given is motivated originally simply by the need to describe mundane phenomena. You couldn't describe the history of the ordinary world without bringing in the soul, because you couldn't describe the ordinary history of the world without telling who had what experiences, and that's not a matter of who had what body. Given that, then, as it were, at death, clearly there are two parts, and clearly the part that decays is the bodily part. So there is another part there. It doesn't need speculative science to give you that. Mere analysis of what being conscious involves gives you that. Of course, it's a further claim that this continues to exist, but it's perfectly compatible with death that it should continue to exist. It doesn't involve any new speculative science of any sort. And so I think the traditional view is much to be preferred on that basis.
If I could just briefly respond to that. I agree with Rich. There are interesting philosophical arguments for substance dualism, and Richard's, he's defended such arguments in several places. And if he's right, then of course, then those arguments alone give us reason to prefer that view. It's because I'm not persuaded by those arguments, and that I do see at least a tension with developmental biology with the substance dualist view, that I'm inclined towards this more monistic view of human nature. And then it's true, the survival of death scenarios look a lot more, it looks like a lot more contrivance is required in order for that to occur. And I agree, but I guess the one thing I would emphasize is that even if substance dualism is true, and I survive death because God preserves my soul, I think that's something miraculous in any case. That is, I don't think it's the Christian view, that the view that Plato held, that the soul is naturally immortal, right? That it just is liberated at death, and it's by its very nature, because it's a simple object, it must persist. I think that a reasonable substance dualism will say that the soul naturally depends on the body. And so when the body decays and is no longer capable of playing that sustaining function, it requires divine intervention to keep it into being. So both views require that God act in a special way outside of ordinary natural processes in order to give us everlasting life.
Both of you are bright, capable Christian philosophers. You've studied these views carefully, and yet there's substantive disagreement between you, and we could bring in 3 or 4 other Christian philosophers and folks who aren't Christians who have different views on this issue. What about the person who says, yeah, this is the problem with philosophical methodology. It's not going to bring any sort of answer to these questions that's going to bring about widespread agreement. How do you respond to that kind of skepticism that this way of going about answering these questions is helpful? Richard, we can start with you.
It's important to remember that philosophy is interested in questions of the deepest kind about what there is what are the total constituents of the world, not just the physical constituents of the world, and what the world depends on. These are very deep questions, and it wouldn't be surprising if it takes many centuries, many millennia to get answers to them. It's taken 2,000 or 3,000 years to get answers to some questions in physics or chemistry, and these are much deeper questions. So it's not surprising in itself, forgetting particular religious considerations, that these things take time. But we are both reasonably convinced that the Christian revelation is true, and we are pointing out alternative ways of how it could be true. And that's useful for people because they may not find one of these ways very compelling, or indeed even at all attractive. Then the other way is available for them to think about the matter. So it is good that there should be a certain variety of ways of spelling out the Christian tradition, so long as its essential message is there. And I think both of our ways are compatible with the essential Christian doctrines on these matters. Doctrines that in life humans have free will, the doctrine that they survive death, the doctrine of a general resurrection after death. If this can be spelled out in more than one way, that is more reason for believing it rather than less.
Yeah, there is plenty of profound disagreement in philosophy among people who studied deep basic issues in philosophy. As Richard says, this is in part a reflection of that we're asking very, very fundamental questions that don't admit of direct empirical verification, although empirical information can bear on some of these questions, as we've been suggesting. We're perhaps not especially well suited as human beings for handling these problems. They're not as well suited perhaps as we are for doing elementary arithmetic, say, or something where we have much more reliable procedures. But I also think that sometimes it's overplayed, the philosophical disagreement. I think there is such a thing as progress in philosophy. There are certainly there's a lot of progress by way of rejection of ideas, where the consensus of informed thinkers is a particular theorist's way of handling a certain issue just won't work for pretty decisive reasons. And so a winnowing, that over time there's a winnowing of the possibilities and greater cultivation of ideas. Many contemporary ideas on basic issues in philosophies are just variations on ideas that Plato and Aristotle held, but they're more sophisticated. They're developed in response to objections to older versions of these views, and so there is some progress. It's just it is a slower progress.
Well, I want to thank you both for your time today and your presence at the Center for Christian Thought.
Thank you very much. Well, we are now at 11:31, and I'm proposing that we take a short break until 11:40, and then continue with our discussion. And I'm sure there are people here who would like to add something. So please start raising your hand so that Monty can see who has questions. I'll see you in about 8 minutes. Thank you. And welcome back from our short break. So I thought this was a very interesting discussion. And one thing that I found kind of interesting is that nobody actually defined what they mean by soul before they started the discussion. And I find sometimes that defining the terms you are discussing is helpful in order to avoid any kind of misunderstanding. So I went to see what is generally considered soul. And it says that it is basically a spiritual essence of a person that includes identity, personality, and memories, an immaterial aspect or essence of a living being that is believed to be able to survive physical death. And depending on philosophical and religious tradition, you know, the presence of a soul may be attributed only to humans, or as one of the speakers said, to mammals, or in some other traditions to all living things, no matter how little or how simple. So I'm inviting you to participate in discussion. I hope there are some hands, and if there are no hands, then I'm going to start calling names out. Okay. Well, I would like first to invite Elmer as a person who knows a lot about how the human brain works and how the mind works. Elmer, would you be willing to, you know, give your understanding and your contribution and comments after this video that we have seen? Thank you.
Okay, here's my 2 cents worth. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, let me put on my face also. Okay, here's what I understand about the brain. We are born with this brain that weighs 3 pounds, and it has the capability of doing better than the best computer we have. And the brain develops by maturation. What happens is the brain is made up of a number of neurons, and neurons communicate from one another. And the experience we have in life is modulated by these brain synapses. So everything we develop is a function of our brain. And we reach a level of full cognition when the brain is fully developed, and that comes about after 25 years old. So if the soul is defined, I don't understand. Soul to me is our mind. I'm a psychiatrist, so I see things differently. But we know that from my standpoint, I don't think the soul continues to live. I think the mind gets destroyed when we die. The soul to me is a function of our brain, and if you destroy the brain at death, you destroy everything. Now that depends if you're talking to a physicist who believes that you could reverse time forward and backward, assuming you can go faster than light, then maybe the soul can exist. But that's more of a quantum discussion. From a psychiatric standpoint, I don't think that there is a soul that lives past our physical life.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Simona, I do have Stephen who has raised his hand. My proposal is we go back to them unless, Simona, you want to respond.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elmer. I think it is a very important aspect of our belief, I believe, that who we are, our identity, our thoughts and ideas and so on are actually part of our physical mind or brain. And I think these two at least in my mind, looking as a scientist, as a physician, I cannot separate them. But I know that Stephen probably has some ideas. I would like to hear them as well.
So yes, my observation is as follows, and I'm going to take this from a faith perspective first. When Christ talks about the two basic commandments, the first is love your God, Lord your God, with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your body, and your soul. And I think he did that deliberately. And so it presupposes, I think it's a matter of a tenement of faith that we, what you choose to believe is really important about this. And my own position is that I do believe in the existence of a soul, and I don't think it's dependent on our physical entity. I think that's, from my perspective, a separate, and I think that God in his miraculous way enables that. I'm inclined to agree with Plato that I think the soul's existence is something that's eternal. So I come from that position, and we also recognize that, the limits of our physical knowledge and understanding neuroscientifically and otherwise, we're just beginning to touch the surface in a lot of ways, and we've got a long way to go. So what this comes down to, from my perspective, is really a tenement of faith, that, what you choose to believe is really important in terms of how you envision what happens after this physical body is at rest full time. And so, it's I think the philosophical discussions in terms of how that occurs between, as the discussion points out, there are lots of different theories and lots of different approaches, but each of us has to approach this, I think, from a matter of faith and belief, as we do a number of things about our faith. And I think this is an important element of that.
Thank you, Stephen. Dana has her hand up.
Very, very interesting conversation. And thank you both, Elmer and Stephen, for your wonderful comments. I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. We don't believe in the existence of soul apart from the body. We believe in resurrection, and we believe that there is eternal life. And I'm not going to get into that. I loved what Stephen said about love God with your soul, because I believe we have a soul that I personally understand as everything that is spiritual in our life, everything that is more than matter. Ideas, emotions, relationships. So when we talk about relationships, it's something interesting. I've discovered this in talking with a lot of my patients. When we talk about the legacy that somebody leaves behind, when you have children, you leave a legacy of your DNA. Your DNA will be passed on, and your DNA will continue to live in your children, in each and every one of them in a different way. When you have strong relationships, when you have a rich spiritual life, your part of your soul will continue to live in your writings, in your poems, in your scientific discoveries, in the relationships that you developed. As long as you are not forgotten, that part of you will continue to exist. So I just wanted to share a very, very personal understanding of the soul from the relational point of view. Thank you.
I muted myself instead of unmuting myself so I could talk. Thank you, Dana. I do not have any other hands up. I want to just make one observation. I found it interesting in the presentation that that all of this is, well, I'm forgetting the one main speaker's name, Swinburne, that he saw the science fiction type description as being so speculative, but he didn't seem to be aware at all of the idea of a spirit that goes on existing apart from body and somehow being out there, who knows where, with who knows what, was not speculative in his mind. He was just felt like he could talk about the speculative nature of the other perspective as showing the superiority of his, which I found kind of interesting. It's all very speculative. I am fascinated by the continuity of personhood, and it's quite mysterious. So I'll leave it at that. Stephen.
I think the challenge is that we're encountering and faced with logical, rational, cognitive kinds of approaches or theories about something of a that's in an entirely different dimension, and we're trying to make connections that help us understand that different dimension in a way that probably only partially applies. And so it's always risky when you go down that path. And so, you know, I think that Swinburne is simply pointing out, not that he's in disagreement with the nature of his own thinking, but he understands it, that for him, that's a theory that works. And that's how we approach things. We look at, but if we're trying to do this on some kind of a rational cognitive basis, that we look for an approach that seems to work or fit for us, given the paradigms that we operate in and understand. And sometimes, well, always, that's reasonably limited, given that we only, you know, have a portion of the picture. I mean, Scripture tells us, now we see through a glass darkly, then we will see face to face. And I think this is one of those pieces of that. This is one factual or element of that, seeing through a glass darkly, and at some point we will see face to face. And whatever your belief is about the existence of the soul or non-existence of the soul, I mean, my own kind of approach to this is that after our individual deaths, we all stand to be reasonably surprised.
I'm right there with you.
You have to be open to that.
I'm right there with you, Stephen. It's very mysterious. Thank you. Peter.
Well, a very interesting discussion between two Christian scientists. The dualism, it's not something recent. It's an old problem. Plato was talking about body and soul, and he believed that the soul is immortal. Then after death, basically, the soul continued to exist. Also, in more modern times, we have Descartes, who sees the Cartian dualism. He was believing in a separation between mind and matter. Now, what I understood from the discussion between these two is basically that they were both believing in somehow in a dualistic way, dualistic explanation. The difference that I see between them is that Richard believed that all is something given, it's a substance. And if we look a little bit at what substance is, we believe that substance basically it's matter that has some physical qualities. And but he was presenting this in a different way as a substance that it doesn't have a place basically in the brain. You cannot locate it. It's something all over. And on the other side, Team believe in the emergent view. That is that the soul evolved sometimes when the body is maturing, and the soul is maturing also with the maturation, call it so, of the body. Then basically this is the main difference that I see between two Christian philosophers. Well, in his blurb, to call it so, David came up with a different point of view. He said that they missed something that he noticed, that basically after people died, what happened is that we continue to exist in the mind of God. Well, this is an explanation, and these two philosophers recognize it's one way to put it, but there are several ways, and there is a lot of speculation in this too. And but I think this is worthy of talking a little bit about, if we can comment on this view of David, that we continue to exist in the mind of God. That means we continue to exist with all our physical qualities and things that makes us individual beings. And of course, if we look at how the Bible is explaining these things, the Bible explains us that God created us in two steps. He took the matter and modeled it and formed man as it is, but the man was not a living soul. God has to intervene with the second step, breathing life and making a living being. Well, we don't know what this living being, this breath of life that God installed in the body is. This is very interesting. Is this something that these two philosophers explain, or is something more than this? And this deserves discussion.
Yeah, Peter, thank you for reminding us of Dave's comment there. I'm wondering if you can share your perspective on the difference between Richard's idea of a spirit, which is more dualistic, difference between spirit and being remembered in the mind of God. Do you see a difference, a difference between those two? The non-dualistic, oh, well, we die, but we're in the memory, we are in God's memory, versus that there's a spirit?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. Well, basically, what I understood from Richard is that spirit is a God-given, is not something that grows up with our physical processes. And if it's a God-given, it's returning to God and continues to exist in his mind. Basically, I don't see a big difference between them.
That's kind of where I was. And so to me, the holding on to the idea of after death continuing to exist in the memory of God isn't very much different than having a spirit that returns. Well, as
Well,
many people would say, we go to heaven. Our spirit
yeah,
goes to
yeah,
heaven.
yeah. We know that this idea of the soul as a separate entity subsists after death. It's something widespread, and it's basically a product of Neoplatonism that inserted into Christianity. And I remember when the Baptist preacher died. Is his name? Graham.
Billy Graham?
Yes, Billy Graham. Thank you. When he died, his son in his eulogy was talking about that now his father is with God now. And there are many Christians that believe in this. But I'm thinking also what Apostle Paul said, that he will receive the crown in that day when God will give it not only to him, but to all of those that were believing in him and serving him, doing his will. Then there are a lot of views, but we try to stay with as much as we can with what the Bible explains to us.
Okay, thank you, Peter. I've got Anastasia, and then I've got a question for Elmer. Anastasia.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you, everyone. It's very interesting. Talking about the spirit, we believe, at least the Eastern Orthodox believe, that the Holy Spirit is a person. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, there are three persons, actually. And personhood, to be a person, thinks, acts, etc. So spirit is not necessarily something else according to the Eastern, but rather a person. And when I was at Newport and I was reading some of Mrs. White's writings, it was very interesting to me when she talked, I think, and correct me, it has been many years, she talked about heavenly bodies. And I have an icon, actually, I gave it to my friend Birta, that portrays the story from the Bible of Christ after his resurrection, showing himself to the disciples, and they were eating, and I suppose it was fish. And they tried to touch him, and she said, "Don't touch me." But somehow he partook in the eating of the fish, which it has been explained, at least in the Eastern Orthodoxy belief, that there is a body, that the spirit, being like the Holy Spirit, that is actually a person, but it's different. It's a different body. It's a heavenly body or celestial body, but it's a body. And I think, and maybe some of you remember better, that Mrs. White, I think, brings that up, that after the resurrection, we will have celestial bodies. Is that true? But anyway, so that's how it's another interpretation of the spirit from Plato to being that belief was always there, and it was a very active thinking, etc., a moral substance or person, the personhood of the spirit. That's another way that some of us see it, or some religions or parts of Christianity see it as a celestial body of the spirit and not just a memory in the mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Anastasia. Is there anyone who would have something to share with Anastasia's question about Ellen White's perspective on the celestial body? I don't know. I am,
I'll be glad to look it up, not today, but it was very vivid in my mind. So I know she has written about that somewhere. Thank
okay,
you.
that would not surprise me. Thank you, Anastasia. Simona,
Well, I have to admit I have a different view. I do not see the point of resurrection if the soul persists after death. I mean, what's the point? If the most important part of your identity is continues after that, then what's the point of resurrection? And you know, in the book of Job, Job said that I the same will see him, my eyes will see him. He speaks of a bodily existence. Apostle Paul also speaks of, you know, incorruptible body that will exist after resurrection. And I believe that, you know, the widespread idea of life after death in some spiritual form is not consistent with my understanding of what the Bible teaches about, you know, soul in general. And so, according to my understanding, and again, you know, I don't hold the corner of truth, this is what I believe, is that a living being is a soul. It's this entity of everything of who we are, and it takes everything, all the aspects of who we are, mental, emotional, physical, all of these together form what I believe we call the soul. And when life is no longer there, there is no longer that identity. The identity is gone. There is no more thought. There is nothing there. And you can consider something that is not quite as dramatic as death, but we often see, for example, in people who have, for example, severe brain injuries or certain types of brain diseases, their personalities change. You know, people who know them say they're not themselves anymore, right? So the core of who we are is definitely in our brain. I mean, there is no question about it. We may not understand all of the aspects of it. We may be only kind of dipping our toes in the knowledge of what our brain is capable of. But there is no question in my mind that this identity of who I am exists in the mind that God has given me.
thank you, Simona.
I have a
Anastasia,
question. I'm sorry. May
yeah,
I?
Anastasia, come on.
Yes. I was going to ask Simona or some of the scientists, how much of our brain are we using? Because I understand even Einstein used only a very small percentage of the brain. And I don't understand, but yeah.
Thank you, Anastasia. That's actually a very common misconception. I have heard often how people say we are using only like 5% of our brain or whatever. Actually, we are using 100% of our brain. All our nerve cells are firing. They're all active. They're not active all at the same time, perhaps because they have different functions. Now, the real question is, are we reaching the full potential of our brain? Now, that's a different question. And I believe that in this respect, I personally don't know anybody who has reached the full potential of what their mind is capable of. If you look at the various abilities that, you know, that our minds are potentially capable of, I mean, this is such an incredibly complex system. I'm constantly amazed at it. Imagine a system that has literally hundreds of billions of cells, and these are not just neurons. You know, I think as for a very long time, science has been looking at neurons exclusively, as an important part of it, but you also have supporting cells or glial cells that outnumber neurons 100 to 1. And so we're looking at hundreds of millions of cells in our brain who are all working in an incredible harmony. I mean, that is such a miracle in itself. And how much of that potential of what our minds are capable of understanding and learning and becoming, I don't think that is something that has an end. I think it's an endless possibility, because even mathematically, I cannot understand, even comprehend the ability of the brain cells to communicate with each other, the complexity of it. The numbers are so incredibly high that my mind cannot comprehend them.
Thank you, Simona. I don't have any additional hands up, so I'm going to take a moment to ask Elmer or Simona a question, either of you, and that is to do with the way of thinking about our identity and how that relates to what's going on in the brain. I think in terms of I have armchair interests in physics, in astronomy, and also in neuropsychology. But I'm not an expert in any of those. But with brain study, the word that often comes to my mind is there's a gestalt. What happens is much more than the sum of the parts. And there seems to be an emergent quality that happens as the parts of the brain are working together, and somehow that has continuity over time. Well, it develops and has a certain amount of continuity. Elmer, I'm wondering, is there a current thinking on how that all comes together? Is there an analogy that's better or clearer than just an emergent quality, which doesn't clarify things very much for me, or the idea of gestalt, that the sum is more than the parts?
Here's what I know. Our brain basically is made of two brains, and they are connected in the middle. What one brain can do, the brain can do as well, but they work complementary. If you have a stroke in one side can take over. So basically, we have two kinds of self in reality. But as long as we have that corpus callosum that connects both, we can coordinate them. We know that because patients with intractable seizures, they cut the connecting part, and that makes them two persons in one brain, in one skull. We know that. So one part of the brain can believe in, can join the Roman Catholic Church, and another part of the brain can be an Adventist. Now you got two people under one skull. We know that, number one. Number two, the brain has different pathways. A brain can go up and down, forward and backwards, and sideways also. Because if you take the new pictures of the brain, they have all those pathways are coordinated. We don't know who in the brain coordinates all these actions. All we know are basically there are three kinds of neurons. You have one neuron that goes from one to the middle, and then it's processed the middle, and then it goes out. So some neuroscientists think that the part of the brain that is critical to judgment is the middle neuron, the small neurons, not the long ones. The long ones only conducts the messages, but something happens in between. They haven't pointed it yet, but they think that it's that small neurons that causes shocks. We also can change personalities by zeroing in on receptors. For instance, someone who is schizophrenic, we can give medication specific for delusions, and we can get them better. We can also give medications specific for obsessions that will relieve some of their symptoms. So now the question is, there has to be a developmental pathway to a soul. I still don't know what a soul is. Soul to me is more or less a theological definition. I don't see that in my practice. But there's a developmental pathway to the soul, to the mind. So if there's a developmental pathway to the mind or to the soul, at what point in time do we get it back? Is it at the tip or as we go down? Because at some point in time, it goes down. We lose cognitive functions. We see that in geriatric psychiatry, where you're not yourself anymore. So when they say we get back our soul, what developmental soul do we get when we're 6 years old, 40 years old, 60 years old, or when we die? So there are a number of questions that I cannot answer as a psychiatrist. Although from my standpoint, these questions, it's best left to God, and he can decide whatever he wants to do. I can only control what I can control on earth.
Okay, thank you, Elmer. I appreciate your sharing your perspective there. David hasn't spoken yet, so I'm going to go to David, and then I see Anastasia has her hand up again, and so does Peter. So David.
Yes, well, a lot could be said about all of this, of course, but the one thing simply that I have discovered is that in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, where it talks about man becoming a living soul, it isn't translated that way in most versions of the Bible. It is in the King James and in the American Standard, but generally it's living being. It's not soul. I think we have an overemphasis on the word soul, as if somehow in English the word soul takes on a special importance. And I suspect it doesn't. You know, the breath of life caused a living being, a holistic mind and body to take place. The other thing is that as to the idea of Ellen White saying that we become a celestial being, I can't find that phrase. I have investigated it and I don't see that. I think she supports the understanding of Paul that at the resurrection we take on immortality and we have new bodies that can live forever at that time, but not that we take on a celestial body at death of any kind. Thank you.
Thank you, David. So I want to, for our gender balance, I'm inclined to come back to Anastasia and then Peter.
And thank you very much, everyone, especially everybody and Elmer. And I had a question because of what you mentioned about the brain. I was a little bit disappointed at what was the name of the first philosopher? Mm-hmm. I thought he meant that the soul was given or something like that once the mind, I suppose, was sufficiently or developed or well developed or something like that. which I think, and I don't know if that's what he meant, it brought questions. Well, what happened to children that are born not as developed, but with mental and especially Elmer deficiencies? So I mean, what is it? God says, well, you know, if you know your ABCs, I'll give you a little bit of a soul, and but if you can know algebra, you really have a chance for the soul. I don't know if that's what he meant it, but it kind of disappointed me that that God, who believe him to be all powerful, and at creation and all this, we say, yes, an animal has a soul, which I believe all living things should have, the way I understand it, but maybe a human that is not sophisticated enough, I'm not going to give a soul. I don't know if I'm over exaggerating, but I would like to hear, especially from Elmer, as far as the the development of the minds and who is worth living, who is not worth living forever. I don't know if that's what he meant, that philosopher meant, but that's how I saw it, and that part really disappointed me.
Elmer, did you want to respond to that?
I'm kind of lost in here. Are you referring to the other guy who talked about the emergent versus the dual?
I think it was the dual. I have to say it again, that he said something about the soul being given when the mind is sufficiently, or I took notes, sufficiently or complicated enough or something like that.
Sufficiently complex.
Right, that's it, sufficiently complex.
Yes, I had brought that up a while ago because I would imagine that there's a developmental pathway to the soul. If there's a developmental pathway to the soul, then that's compelling evidence that that the soul basically is a function of the brain. You know, so what happens to the soul if one is born with Down syndrome, or with autism, or the unfortunate, you know, the schizophrenia or bipolar? We know these are heavily influenced genetically. Some are not, but schizophrenia is now known as a biological diagnosis. So is bipolar and attention deficit disorder also. So the soul, I mean, I'm an Adventist, third generation Adventist. I believe what the Bible says, but there are different explanations how to draw lessons from the Bible. There's no one true interpretation.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Because in the salvation, if by salvation meaning existing near God, depends on how well our brain is developed. That's too sad, and at least from the Bible, I don't think that's there. And the other thing is about this. If we try to, and I'm not underestimating science, but my humble belief is, and maybe that's why most of Christianity, they do believe in the resurrection or in things that are inconceivable biologically right now. But sometimes, especially in Protestantism, if I may say, we don't accept the mystical, and that's a personal choice. Because if there are things we cannot explain and we call it mystical, we know they exist, then it's reasonable to believe in the resurrection, in my humble. But the creator that we know, I don't think will judge by how complex the mind is in order to live a human being or an animal live. That's my humble interpretation.
Well, so,
thank you.
and I think, I'll step in, it's inconceivable to me that in terms of my perspective of the character of God, a loving God would make that kind of judgment. that I think, and that's why I believe in the existence of the soul that's immortal and from the beginning, because it doesn't make those kinds of distinctions, and nor could it. And in my view, the character of a loving God would not be consistent with that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anastasia and Stephen. I'm going to go to Peter.
Peter?
Well, yes, I'm sorry, I had a little difficulty. Another idea that I want to bring to you is that the Bible is giving us some glimpses about how we are going to look eventually after the resurrection. And I'm trying to put together two different things. One of the gospel writers, it's talking about a powerful earthquake when Jesus was resurrected. And at that time, many faithful believers throughout the centuries were resurrected, and they were forming the train of Jesus that was taken up to heaven. The first fruits, this Bible is calling also. And I'm trying to put this idea to connect it with what we studied recently in Revelation, that around the throne of God, surrounding the throne of God, there are 24 elders. Well, these 24 elders, in my view, are, I believe, those from those that were resurrected and were following Jesus when he was taken up to heaven. Then how are we going to look after the resurrection? Well, John didn't see anything different from human beings as you knew them. Then it looks like we're going to look the way we looked. Only different, receiving eternal life and different physical capacities and so forth and so on, but we're going to look the same. And today, he was mentioning something about the soul that it can be read it in a different way. Well, I submit to you, what about the souls under the altar that John is talking in Revelation? Souls under the altar.
All right, thank you, Peter. I see that McKinley has something to share with us. McKinley, we've still got you muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
I am so sorry.
The phone.
Thank you. Yeah, this is one of the technically challenging Sabbaths. So I got a couple of comments here very quickly, but first, thanks to Simona, Monty, Lisa, and Dave for making this week's stimulating program possible. So Dave suggested that the consideration of the topic be from both a philosophical and science perspective. As I watched the video, I was looking for a thermodynamic treatment of the topic that the discussants were dealing with. I didn't find that. I found some allusions to it just generally. But when you think about the discussion, it can be organized around three broad themes: this macro composition of humans, with Swinburne thinking about the dualist perspective, and Dr. Connor talking about the unitary perspective. Then there was the role of brain circuits and how that plays into this idea of the soul, and I have soul here in quotes. Also, how all of this plays into the continued existence, to use a phrase by Dr. Connor, and how that ushers in the general resurrection. So the question that I sort of posed, can these three themes fit within a thermodynamic perspective? I found that Swinburne asserts that there is a second bodily component without, in my thinking, supporting it. He says that the soul is the vehicle of human identity and persists. Dr. O'Connor, I found his thinking a little bit more persuasive in that he said that at death, humans cease to be. He said he based this on the idea that psychological thought capacities and processes require a body to persist, and that when these physical processes cease, then the human entity, that living entity, that unitary entity ceases. Here is my thermodynamic consideration. If we take Swinburne's view that the soul is a separate entity with inherent immortality that persists, the question that arises is, can this entity also exist at absolute zero or continue to function at absolute zero being a thermodynamic concept? And the answer to that question would be no. And so that means that Dr. O'Connor's perspective, where when the physical processes, the psychological processes, the brain circuits functions cease to exist, that then the human being also ceases to exist. So this is my little contribution from the thermodynamic perspective.
Thank you, McKinley. Of course, that gets to the mysterious nature of the substance of spirit if you're going to have a dualistic perspective. And is that substance like the substance that God is made of? So McKinley, I'm going to come back to you. Can God exist in absolute zero from a thermodynamic perspective?
That's a very, very good question, Monty. Thank you for asking that. So this is thinking off the top of my head. Since I believe thermodynamic processes governs all of the universe, and since I believe that God would be God's nature would be consistent with those thermodynamic processes. Also, since I also believe that with God all things are possible, there might be the possibility that the Lord could exist outside of absolute zero. But again, this is not something that I've thought in detail about, and the question you pose is one that is worth thinking very carefully about. But generally, the thermodynamic view would be that nothing exists, or nothing can function at absolute zero.
All right, thank you. I'm going to come to Stephen. I want to follow up on my question just a little bit. If I took Richard to be talking about the idea that, I mean, he believes in, has the dualistic perspective, believes in a separate spirit, but that the spirit works through the body, in and through the body. At least that's what I understood him to say, which from my perspective is not a lot different from, and if the body isn't there, it can't work through it.
It's a different body.
So it's somewhere, but I don't get the sense that it can do anything. And so
Is that,
in that sense,
forgive me.
the two seem very similar. and I'm unconvinced of the importance of the distinction, unless, as some people have brought up, well, what if we want to have an event called the resurrection? It may make that event possible or not, but I personally have a hard time seeing a real distinction here, and that's kind of where I've been for the last 20 years on this topic. So I'm probably a little closer to Stephen than I am to a lot of other things. Stephen, you were raising your hand, and then I see Peter's hand is up.
Yeah. So just in responding to McKinley, and I would agree, but I would push beyond that it's a possibility that God exists, outside the dynamics of outside of thermodynamics. I think that at least the God that I believe in is outside of space and time and all of the laws of nature, that he or God put those in place, but being the eternal creator, it's unfathomable, and all of the awesomeness of God is unfathomable in terms of our current understanding of the natural law and the laws of science and so forth. So that's my take on that, and therefore, given that, I also think that the a priori that there is a soul, it makes sense, given that God has designated us to have his presence in our lives in 3 dimensions: God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. And so we have to be cognizant from a faith standpoint of how those work and how we interact with those, and the dimensions that we are given. And I go back to that point of scripture. See, I think when Christ talked about worshiping the Lord your God, with what he was pointing out was, here are all the elements of your existence, all the dimensions of your existence, and you're called to worship God in each of those. And so I use that as kind of a foundational perspective for these discussions. And so that's kind of my take on that. But I think we do a great disservice to our faith and to our understanding of God to begin to set any limits and definitions that kind of conscribes God in a particular way. And I think that's really important to take, from my perspective as a Christian, to take that approach.
Thank you, Stephen. Simona, I've got Peter, and then I'm going to suggest that after Peter, we bring it back to you to wrap things up for us. Peter.
My thought about the question, I think that Monty asked McKinley. I believe that this is related to the transcendence and immanence of God. God is outside of his universe. God existed eternally, and the universe was created at the point in time. And God existed before the universe was created. Then don't see any connection between thermodynamics and God existence. Thermodynamics, it's a creation of God. And God is outside of the universe, it's transcendent. My answer.
Thank you very much, Peter and Elmer, Anastasia, and Stephen, McKinley, Dana, Monty. Obviously, these are such interesting thoughts and ideas, and I think these are thoughts that started long ago and will continue long after we are gone. And I think one of those questions that people eternally ask is, who am I? And some of this discussion was brought this question forward. In our conclusion, I would like to read a poem written by Dietrich Bonhoeffer entitled, Who Am I? Who am I? Who am I? They often tell me I come out of my cell calmly, cheerfully, resolutely, like a lord from his palace. Who am I? They often tell me I used to speak to my orders freely and friendly and clearly, as though it were mine to command. Who am I? They also tell me I carried the days of misfortune equably, smilingly, proudly, like one who is used to winning. Am I really then what others say of me? Or am I only what I know of myself? Restless, melancholic, and ill, like a caged bird, struggling for breath, as if hands clasp my throat, hungry for colors, for flowers, for the songs of birds, thirsty for friendly words and human kindness, shaking with anger at fate and at the smallest sickness, trembling for friends at an infinite distance, tired and empty at praying, at thinking, at doing, drained and ready to say goodbye to it all. Who am I? This or the other? Am I one person today and another tomorrow? Am I both at once? In front of others, a hypocrite, and to myself a contemptible, fretting weakling? Or is something still in me like a battered army, running in disorder from a victory already achieved? Who am I? These lonely questions mock me. Whoever I am, you know me. I am yours, O God. And our blessing for the week. The embrace of the Father be the comfort you desire. The name of the Son be the one on whom you rely. The presence of the Spirit be with you every hour. The three in one be the focus of all you are. See you next week.
Thank you, Simona. Very inspiring. Thank you.